At exactly 21:47 hours Gulf Standard Time, silence fell over the Persian Gulf that had not been felt in decades. Then, without warning, the night sky above Kharg Island, a 5-mile strip of coral and steel sitting 16 miles off Iran's southwestern coast, was torn apart by the most concentrated display of American air and sea power ever unleashed in the modern Middle East. What you are about to hear is not fiction. It happened. And it may have just reset the countdown clock on a war that is spiraling toward a point of no return. The first indication that something extraordinary was imminent came at 21:03 hours, when U.S. Navy E-2D Advanced Hawkeye AEW aircraft operating from the USS Gerald R. Ford, the Ford-class carrier now permanently stationed in the Red Sea, detected a coordinated surge in Iranian IRGC radar emissions across Kharg Island's integrated air defense network. The S-300 PMU-2 batteries were going active. The 23mm ZU-23 anti-aircraft emplacements were warming their fire control systems. Iran knew something was coming. What they did not know was the scale. At 21:19 hours, beneath the ink-black surface of the Arabian Sea, 3 U.S. Navy Virginia-class submarines simultaneously opened their vertical launch system hatches. The BGM-109E Tomahawk Block 5 cruise missiles, the latest variant, equipped with Maritime Strike Tomahawk seekers capable of terminal homing on stationary and relocatable targets through heavy electronic clutter, began their subsonic journey at 550 miles per hour across the darkened waters of the Gulf. Each missile was pre-programmed with a precision strike package developed over 48 hours of continuous ISR collection by RQ-4 Global Hawk drones and classified overhead satellite assets. These were not area weapons. These were surgical instruments, each one assigned a grid coordinate tied to a specific hardened military structure on the island. Simultaneously, U.S. Air Force B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, operating under radio silence from an undisclosed forward staging base, sources indicate Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, released GBU-57A/B massive ordnance penetrators from altitude. At 30,000 pounds each, these bunker busters were designated for Kharg Island's underground missile storage vaults, the fortified bunkers that the IRGC had spent years hardening, following the lessons of the 2003 Iraq War. The B-2's radar cross-section, the size of a golf ball on Iranian radar screens, meant those bunkers never saw them coming. At the same time, and this is the piece of the puzzle that most analysts are still processing, U.S. Central Command launched the low-cost uncrewed combat attack system, LUCAS, in its first mass deployment combat application. Modeled directly on Iran's own Shahed 136 kamikaze drone, but fitted with American precision GPS-INS guidance and a dual-effect warhead, swarms of LUCAS drones entered Kharg Island's airspace from multiple vectors simultaneously, each assigned to saturate the island's radar-guided CIWS and ZSU systems with overlapping threats. The result was a calculated electronic and kinetic overload. Iran's layered air defense on Kharg, which had been hardened through years of post-sanction investment, was overwhelmed within the first 4 minutes of the engagement. What unfolded over the next 23 minutes was, by the account of U.S. Central Command's own official statement, one of the largest precision strike packages executed in the history of CENTCOM operations. More than 90 individual military targets were struck. Naval mine storage facilities, the ones the IRGC had been using to seed the Strait of Hormuz with Mark 65 influence mines and newer domestically produced Sadaf moored contact mines, were detonated in a chain of secondary explosions that lit the northwestern Persian Gulf orange for 6 full minutes. The explosions triggered secondary detonations so powerful they were felt 40 miles away on the Iranian mainland, in the port city of Bushehr, where residents described the ground shaking like an earthquake. Missile storage bunkers containing Noor anti-ship missile batteries, the Iranian derivative of the Chinese C-802, the same missile that struck the INS Honnet in 2006, were reduced to rubble. The IRGC's naval base on the island, home to fast attack craft and midget submarine assets used in swarm harassment operations against Gulf shipping, was destroyed with such precision that post-strike satellite imagery showed the adjacent oil terminal infrastructure completely unscathed. That last detail is the most strategically loaded fact of the entire operation. President Trump posting on Truth Social at 22:03 hours, while the last Tomahawk warheads were still finding their targets, described the operation as one of the most powerful bombing raids in the history of the Middle East. He did not bury the threat that followed. Should Iran or anyone else do anything to interfere with the free and safe passage of ships through the Strait of Hormuz, I will immediately reconsider this decision. The decision not to wipe the oil infrastructure from the face of the island was not a sign of restraint. It was the most calculated pressure play in modern coercive diplomacy. The oil terminal, the physical choke point through which 90% of Iran's $53 billion in annual crude revenues flows, was left standing as a hostage. But Iran was not finished. At 03:12 hours on March 15th, barely 34 hours after the Kharg Island raid, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Aerospace Force executed what it described internally as its first Category 1 retaliatory strike package. The IRGC simultaneously launched Iranian Haidar-3 hypersonic glide vehicles, Tehran's newest and most advanced strategic munition, alongside conventional Imad-2 medium-range ballistic missiles and Shahed-238 jet-powered kamikaze drones in a multi-axis, multi-domain salvo aimed at 3 simultaneous target sets: U.S. Forward Operating Base Harar in Iraqi Kurdistan, Erbil International Airport, and hardened positions across northern Israel. At the same moment that the launch plumes were detected by U.S. space-based infrared system satellites, detection to alert in under 11 seconds. The AN/TPY-2 radars forward deployed across the region began feeding track data into the integrated IAMD architecture, integrated air and missile defense. The terminal high-altitude area defense batteries at Al-Dhafra and Eskin Village fired their first interceptors within 90 seconds of launch detection. THAAD's hit-to-kill interceptors, designed to destroy ballistic re-entry vehicles outside the atmosphere through kinetic impact, began their climb. Simultaneously, over the skies of northeastern Israel, the Rafael David sling weapon system was tracking the Imad ballistic re-entry vehicles descending at Mach 7. The Stunner interceptor missiles, with their unique hit-to-kill plus proximity detonation dual-mode warheads, fired in ripple sequences, 2 per incoming target, following Israel's long-standing doctrine of over-intercept to guarantee kill probability above 95%. But the real threat was not the ballistic missiles. It was the drones. Iran's Shahed-238 jet variants, flying at low altitude under 300 feet, AGL to exploit radar terrain masking, were threading through the gaps between fixed IADS nodes, heading for the UAE. In Abu Dhabi's airspace, the UAE's integrated THAAD Patriot Falcon Shield multi-layer defense network was already tracking 42 separate airborne objects simultaneously. In the space of one night, UAE air defenses intercepted 9 ballistic missiles and 33 drones. The debris from 2 drones brought down over the Fujairah coast triggered a structural fire on an industrial facility, the first physical damage to UAE soil from an Iranian strike in the history of the two nations. The geopolitical pressure at that moment was almost impossible to overstate. Consider the arithmetic of what was unfolding simultaneously in a single 24-hour combat period. U.S. and Israeli aircraft were conducting over 150 individual sorties across Iran, including against nuclear-adjacent infrastructure in Isfahan and command centers in Tehran. The IDF had by that point executed more than 7,600 strikes across Iran in the opening 3 weeks of the war, nearly 5,000 individual aerial sorties. Iran had fired over 500 ballistic and naval missiles and nearly 2,000 drones since February 28th. The Strait of Hormuz, through which flows 20% of the world's daily oil supply, 33% of global fertilizer shipments, and 20% of global LNG, was a de facto war zone. Oil futures had exploded above $100 per barrel for the first time since 2022. The UN World Food Program was already issuing warnings about global food security cascades tied to fertilizer supply disruption. The world was not watching a regional conflict. It was watching the beginning of something that could reprice every economy on Earth. The U.S. military's response to the IRGC's retaliatory volley was precise and methodical. At FOB Harir, hardened blast shelters absorbed the impacts with no casualties reported. a testament to the post-2020 force protection upgrades mandated across all CENTCOM forward positions following the January 2020 Iranian ballistic missile attack on Al-Assad. U.S. Patriot PAC-3 MSE interceptors, the most advanced variant of the Patriot system with a radically expanded engagement envelope, handled the incoming threat with near-perfect intercept rates. Meanwhile, in a development that the mainstream reporting cycle barely had time to process, the U.S. Precision Strike Missile, the PRSM, a ground-launched hypersonic precision weapon being deployed in combat for the very first time in this conflict, executed strikes against IRGC Aerospace Force ground-based launcher sites in western Iran, identified by Signals Intelligence as the origin points of the Haidar-3 launches. The PRSM, with its ability to strike targets beyond 500 kilometers at hypersonic speeds from mobile ground launchers, represents the U.S. Army's answer to the anti-access/area denial problem, and it was being blooded in real combat against a real adversary for the first time in history. Iran's response to the Kharg Island strike carried a secondary dimension that went largely unreported: the revelation of how deeply Tehran had prepared the battlefield, not just kinetically, but economically. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi issued a statement that was not bombast. It was a precisely calibrated threat matrix. Iran would target U.S. financial institutions and multinational companies operating across the 6 Gulf states. It would strike the facilities of American energy companies in the region. It identified the USS Gerald R. Ford's presence in the Red Sea as a legitimate target, and it confirmed what intelligence analysts had feared. The IRGC's Quds Force had pre-positioned operational assets across the Gulf states for a final option campaign against regional energy infrastructure, including the Abqaiq Khurais complex in Saudi Arabia, the single largest oil processing facility on Earth, capable of disrupting 5% of global daily oil supply if destroyed. JP Morgan's Commodity Research Desk had already sent its internal warning note. The destruction of Kharg Island's oil infrastructure would have implications not measurable in any normal financial model. Qatar's energy minister had warned that force majeure declarations across Gulf energy producers were imminent if the war continued. The Fertilizer Institute confirmed that nearly 50% of global urea and sulfur exports were at risk from Strait of Hormuz disruption. This was not a military conflict anymore. It was a weapons system aimed at the entire architecture of the global economy. And yet, the oil terminal on Kharg Island was still standing. At 06:18 hours on March 16th, as the first light of dawn touched the Persian Gulf, the island's petroleum infrastructure remained functional. Iranian tankers were still loading crude. The undersea pipelines connecting Kharg to the Abazar, Firuzan, and Doraud offshore fields were still flowing. The senior provincial governor of Bushehr province confirmed through the IRNA state news agency that exports and imports from Kharg Island were proceeding normally. The United States had executed the most precise, most powerful unilateral military strike in the history of Persian Gulf operations, and then handed Iran its oil revenue back as a negotiating chip. This is the doctrine of coercive compellence at its most sophisticated and its most dangerous. Because the calculation only works if the other side blinks. And as of this broadcast, Iranian Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, son of Ali Khamenei, assassinated by U.S.-Israeli intelligence operatives on February 28th, the act that triggered this entire war, had issued his first formal public statement. He would not negotiate under fire. The Strait of Hormuz would remain a weapon. The axis of resistance would continue to fight. Hezbollah was already engaged in renewed ground contact with Israeli forces across southern Lebanon, having displaced nearly 1 million people in renewed fighting. The IRGC's aerospace force was publicly promising its most advanced weaponry for future strikes. This is not a war approaching its end. It is a war that has just revealed its true dimensions. For the sailors of the USS Gerald R. Ford Strike Group operating in a body of water where Iranian naval mines have been seeded, where IRGC fast attack craft operate in swarm doctrines designed to overwhelm a single destroyer's CIWS, where submarine warfare remains a constant background threat. Every hour of that deployment is a sustained act of controlled exposure to catastrophic risk. for the air crews flying sortie after sortie over Iran's territory in F-35s and F/A-18S, threading through degraded but still active S-300 and Bavar 373 engagement envelopes. The margin between a routine strike package and an international incident is measured in milliseconds and radar shadows. The lesson written in fire over Kharg Island on March 13, 2026, is one that will be studied in war colleges for the next 50 years. The most powerful military in human history can destroy 90 targets on an island in under 23 minutes and choose, with surgical deliberation, what to leave standing. That choice is not mercy. It is leverage. The question that every government, every energy market, every navy in the world is now asking in private is the same one you need to be asking. What happens the night Trump decides to stop leaving anything standing? Stay alert. Stay informed. Because the next 72 hours in the Persian Gulf will determine whether this conflict remains a war between three nations or becomes the opening act of something the world has no name for yet. Would you be ready if the Strait of Hormuz closed tomorrow? Comment below.